in an experiment.
We don't know yet.
Why is light so far?
Like, it sounds so simple.
They had no idea.
But now the data speaks.
I find this not only refreshing, but at some level astounding.
Nature.
Welcome back to the Nature Podcast. This week, the race to understand mental health after devastating floods.
And what concerns do scientists have going into the US election? I'm Emily Bates.
And I'm Nick Petrichow. In April and May of this year, floods overwhelmed much of the state of Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil. This is Maria Margarete Jaskulski, recounting how her home and most of her possessions, except what she'd quickly been able to stash in a drawer that she put on top of her bed, had been overtaken by the floods.
Eu sei que eu ainda sou jovem, mas ao mesmo tempo eu já tenho 58 anos, né? E eu disse, agora como vai ser? Eu me senti sem chão. Foi muito dolorido isso pra mim.
She says, I'm 58 years old, right? And I lost everything. I know I'm still young, but at the same time, I'm already 58 years old. And now, what will happen? Maria is just one of 2 million people that were affected by the floods. And as climate change makes such events more likely, what can science do to help people put their lives back together after a disaster?
I am from Brazil, and back in April and May, when these huge floods happened, everybody was talking about it.
This is Mariana Linearo, a reporter at Nature who's been writing a feature article about the floods.
And people in Brazil were very concerned about the effects of these floods in the local population. And I wanted to see if I could write something about it. So I wondered about how it would impact people's mental health.
Mariana travelled to Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul a few months after the floods to talk with many of the affected people and the scientists who are studying mental health in the region.
And when I got to Porto Alegre and I got on an Uber to go to the hotel, I didn't even bring up the topic, but the driver already started talking about the floods. He said, oh, look, do you see the marks in the walls of where the water went up to? And yeah, when I started paying attention to the marks, to the brown marks on the walls, I started seeing them everywhere. The color of the city became kind of brown because the mud had taken over everything.
The floods were caused by torrential rain, failures of infrastructure, as well as climate change. The World Weather Attribution Initiative found that in this case, human-induced climate change increased both the likelihood and intensity of the floods. Now, that study has yet to be peer-reviewed, but in some ways, these floods are just a sign of things to come. Climate change has already been linked to the increasing numbers of weather-related disasters that the world has seen, and as the planet continues to heat up, it makes them even more likely. And these disasters don't just destroy property or infrastructure, people's lives are destroyed too. This is Eliana Silva de Araujo. She's saying that when she got here, there was only destruction. Here, being a shelter, you can maybe hear some of the other people in the background. This shelter was actually the second shelter that Eliana had gone to. Her home had been destroyed in a previous flood, and then in the floods of April to May, the shelter she was in was also destroyed.
Que a senhora já conhecia?
Sim, das outras enchentes, sim.
Ah, tá.
Tem muito deles aqui. Aqui a gente sofre muito preconceito por ser baiano, né?
Ah, é?
Também é, mas com nós...
She told me that the floods themselves is not what affected her the most, but she talked about some of the problems that she faced in the shelters. They have problems with drug and alcohol use, and also she reported that she felt she was discriminated because she comes from a different state in Brazil. She comes from Bahia, a state in the northeast of Brazil. And she said she felt discriminated by her neighbors. And she said at one point she had to receive psychiatric care. She received some medication to help her deal with all of that.
Eliana is now in a better place. She's made peace with the fact that she's living in a shelter and won't return to her home soon after receiving mental health care. And that's why, for many of the people in the region, even if they themselves were affected by the floods, making sure there was access to such services was hugely important to them.
Foram várias sessões, principalmente no mês de maio, que foi dia 13 de maio, né?
This is Anderson Nunes Jardim.
Só das enchentes.
Seus pacientes são todos da região, assim, mas...
Anderson, he's a clinical psychologist, and he lives with his mother in this address for his whole life. And his house was flooded, and he and his mother fled to his sister's house. And he decided to keep seeing his patients online because he was in a safe place, and he knew that his patients would need him because most of his patients were also affected by the floods or had relatives who were affected.
In the face of a traumatic event like floods destroying homes and lives, experiencing anxiety, sadness, hopelessness, difficulty sleeping, fatigue, among other symptoms of distress, is pretty expected. But in some cases, like with Eliana, they can become more persistent mental health problems. And this is where science can make a difference. It can find the best way to help people put their lives back together and stop problems becoming chronic after people are faced with the worst things imaginable.
So the issue with mental health in Brazil is that until now there isn't a national research looking into the mental health of the Brazilian population.
In an unfortunate coincidence, there was an event organised to do exactly this. But as researchers gathered at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul to launch a project to look at the mental health of the country, they had to evacuate due to the floods. But concerned about the effects of the floods on the mental health of everyone in the region, one of the researchers spent a sleepless night writing a proposal for an online survey to get a snapshot of their reactions.
So the initial data which she collected in the month following the first days of the flood showed that a high percentage of the population were describing symptoms of moderate to severe anxiety and depression, which is something expected, but it's good to have that data to understand how these people evolve over time. Most of those people who reported those symptoms, they tend to get better, but some don't. So that's the portion of the population that researchers are concerned about.
In fact, the survey found that those with lower incomes and who had been most directly affected by the floods reported more symptoms, which was actually a surprise, as the expectation was that those people would be too preoccupied with surviving to feel such reactions. Researchers hope that surveys like this one can help direct resources to people like this who need them the most. Also, having a solid evidence base to help people is key, according to researchers, as mistakes have been made in the past.
What I heard from experts in the mental health response to disasters is that in previous events, for example, there was a mining dam collapse in a city called Brumadinho in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. There sometimes can be an overdiagnosis of mental health problems in the initial aftermath of the disaster, when these reactions should be considered normal, and people are diagnosed and they feel like they are victims and they become dependent on healthcare professionals. And that's not good because it doesn't empower the population to come together and demand changes.
After assessing previous crises, researchers think it's key that the population comes together.
What's really important in this initial phase after a disaster is to strengthen the community so that people can rely on each other. That is something that has been proven to prevent long-term mental health issues.
Strengthening of community bonds has been shown to help people deal with the crisis and even reduce the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. More climate disasters are inevitable, so going forward, research can help us not make the same mistakes again. Resources can be better directed and more quickly implemented, and researchers can come up with strategies to help build community bonds in the wake of a disaster. As for people like Anderson, who you heard from earlier, after his house was ruined by the floods, it was his friends who helped him put his life back together. This is Anderson's mother. She's saying it's a good thing that Anderson has a lot of friends.
So when the water receded, he went back to his house and he saw that he was going to need a lot of help putting things back together because it was filled with mud, and even getting into the house was difficult because all of the furnitures had moved around with the water. So he reached out to some friends, and then on a Saturday morning, 18 friends showed up equipped to do like a cleanup, and they helped him. Like in one day they removed all of the furniture, they helped clean up the mud, and that made it possible for him and his mother to come back home in a few days. And when I was leaving his house, I saw that there were some plants in the planter, and I was surprised that they had survived the flood. So I asked Anderson's mother, her name is Jurema, I asked, have these plants survived the flood? And then she said, no, the plants all died, but these are new plants because our friends planted them.
That was Nature's Mariana Lignaro. This work was also supported by the Pulitzer Center. For more on that story, check out the show notes for a link to Mariana's feature.
Coming up, a poll reveals Nature readers' worries about a possible Trump victory. Right now, though, it's time for the research highlights with Noah Baker.
Physicists have used a brand new approach to synthesize an ultra-heavy element, and they hope this could pave the way to new record-breaking finds. The heaviest element scientists have produced thus far is oganesson, which has an atomic number of 118. This was synthesized by shooting calcium atoms at the element californium. But creating heavier elements using this technique would require the use of either einsteinium or fermium, both of which are extremely rare and unstable. So a team in the US took a new approach. They shot a beam of titanium ions at a foil made of plutonium, which is more stable and less rare than einsteinium and fermium. The resulting collisions produced a wide variety of shrapnel, mostly from the plutonium and titanium breaking into smaller pieces. But on 2 occasions, the researchers detected the telltale decay product of the heavy element livermorium-290, which has a half-life of just 9 milliseconds. This indicated that some nuclei of the titanium and plutonium had merged together to create a much larger nucleus. Livermorium has an atomic number of 116. The researchers say that these titanium beams could enable the synthesis of the unknown element 119 and beyond. You can read more about that discovery in Physical Review letters. Ever wondered how a single-celled plankton moves in water? Well, probably not, but the answer could be by blowing up like a balloon. Some plankton can't swim, but that doesn't mean they can't move. And now scientists have discovered that at least one species migrates towards the sun by regulating its buoyancy, a bit like a submarine. Until now, movement like this has been a bit of a puzzle. After all, many single-celled plankton have no appendages to propel themselves with. But now a team in the States have shed some light on the mystery using a specially designed rotating chamber, which allowed them to study the bioluminescent algal plankton Pyrocystis noctiluca. P. noctiluca cells are normally around 5% denser than seawater, so they sink. But after cell division, the 2 new cells selectively take on relatively less dense water into a bladder, swelling to around 6 times their original size. This reduces their density and allows them to beat gravity, migrating up to 200 meters towards the surface in search of sunlight for photosynthesis. Eventually, the cell sinks back down, divides, and the process starts again. The authors say that this study illustrates a potentially fundamental link between physiology, ecology, and evolution at the cellular level. You can check out that research in Current Biology.
The US election is only days away, and whichever candidate wins will shape American policy for the next 4 years, including, of course, science. So, to find out what researchers are most concerned about, Nature has conducted a poll of its readers. Reporter Jeff Tollefson has been writing a story based on the results, and he joins me now to talk about what the election means to our readers. Jeff, hi, how's it going?
Good. Good to be here. Thanks, Nick.
Well, I'm interested to dive into the results with you, but before we do, I guess it's worth mentioning that we're talking a week before the election, and at this point, it really seems like it could be anyone's race, right?
Yeah, I mean, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are in kind of a dead heat in most polls across the country, as well as in the key kind of battleground states. And you could say the same for the House of Representatives and the Senate. Most people seem to give the Republicans a slight edge in both of those, but it's anybody's guess.
And so, as I mentioned, Nature's been doing a poll of its readers, and you've been diving into the results. Can you tell us what are the sort of key headlines of the poll?
Well, there are a few. The first one is that scientists care. They think this election is important, both to themselves in their lives and to science more broadly. And the second would be that they broadly support Harris over Trump. And the third, and perhaps the most surprising, is that quite a few of them would in fact consider changing where they live or study if their preferred candidate doesn't win. And those numbers are tilted toward Harris supporters more than Trump supporters.
And what are the issues that people are concerned about that may make them think perhaps I should consider moving if my preferred candidate doesn't win?
Well, there are different things. I mean, if you look at why people think the election's important, surprisingly, perhaps the number one reason cited is climate change. And then it goes down, a lot of people say security issues, whether that's domestic security or global security. There we're talking about wars, we might be talking about immigration, depending on who's actually ticking the box, public health issues. So there are a range of things, but a lot of the folks who say that they would consider, changing where they live or work or study, a lot of these folks are more concerned about the core issues of democracy and authoritarian rhetoric under Trump and the political polarization. They cite the fact that it seems like the United States can't even agree on basic facts anymore. It's become so polarized. And in fact, some 86% of the respondents to this poll said the outcome of the election will affect whether the United States remains a good place to build a career in science. So that says a lot.
It raises questions about whether a Trump presidency could lead to, I guess, sort of a brain drain. What do you think about that?
So, the fact is that we don't know. People say that they think about major life changes, and they can say that for years or decades without ever making them. So it's hard to predict. But the numbers do clearly point to a very high level of anxiety. And the very fact that we have some of our best and brightest saying things like that is a reason for concern. The other thing that I would note, and this came out in another story that we wrote recently, a feature story on the future of U.S. science, none other than the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine recently released a report raising concerns about the political polarization and the anti-immigration rhetoric, basically harming the U.S. reputation abroad as a place that's attractive to foreign scientists. So these concerns about whether the U.S. is going to remain a place that can attract talent from abroad are being raised at the very highest levels of U.S. science.
And as you mentioned, one of the key concerns that many people had was climate change. Now, can you tell me a little bit about what each of the candidates would do if they were elected on this huge issue?
Yeah, there are lots of places where there are clear differences, but on climate change, it's very stark. We don't know specifically what a Harris administration is going to do, but we do know that she's part of the Biden administration and that a lot of those team members are going to stay. And a lot of the Biden administration's big climate policies extend out to 2032. So the Biden climate agenda is really not even midway through its course. And one can expect that a Harris administration would continue that and perhaps double down on it. What double down means is the big question. But what we know is that the big investments in clean energy technologies and advanced manufacturing and, ways to reduce carbon emissions and even pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, those would continue under Harris. And President Trump and his supporters basically want to toss all of that out. They want to figure out ways to cancel those investments to the extent that they can. It might not be easy because they're written into law, but they will do what they can to slow that down and to boost fossil fuel production. And you have to remember that the United States is the world's second largest emitter, and just on its own, it can drive the climate into very dangerous territory, regardless of what the rest of the world does.
And as we mentioned, the vast majority of people who responded to the survey were in favour of a Harris presidency. What were the thoughts of the minority, the 6% who were Trump supporters?
Most of Trump supporters in our poll tend to cite security issues and economic issues. And if you look through the comments, we reached out to one. The feeling of this respondent was that Trump would be more likely to end the war in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And he basically says science funding is irrelevant when you've got big wars going on. And others say they're worried about the economy and their ability to pay for their families. There's also another set of folks out there who aren't happy with Harris or Trump, and they registered some protest votes for Green Party candidates. And we even mentioned one in the story who put in his vote for Bugs Bunny. Mickey Mouse also made an appearance.
And from their perspective, what were their concerns? Why did neither candidate fit the bill for them?
Well, basically what they say is that neither candidate appears ready to really tackle the big challenges. Precisely what that means, I don't know. But Harris got a lot of pushback in the presidential debate after she went out and, she emphasized climate and said that we're going to take care of this grand problem. But she also, on the other hand, emphasized that she's not against fracking for oil and gas. And if you parse her words, she didn't technically say that she's going to support oil and gas production, but, she was speaking to a certain element with those statements. And those are the kinds of things that make people who are worried about climate change worried. The fact is that if you want to address climate change, you have to stop all fossil fuel production unless it's completely mitigated by carbon capture and sequestration.
So we're a week away from the election. What are your predictions going forward?
Yeah. That's a tough question, and I would question anybody who thinks they have an answer. What I can say is that the polls are all over the place in general, but if you average them up, they tend to show perhaps a slight advantage for Harris. Now, what we know from years past is that the polls are always wrong. The question this time is how they're going to be wrong. In 2016, the polls completely missed the swell of support for Trump. In 2020, again, Biden was predicted to win by a relatively comfortable margin, and the polls were wrong. Trump very nearly pulled that off. So one slice of the people looking at these polls say that the polls actually underestimate Trump's support. And if that's the case, then Trump's clearly going to win. But there is a counter argument, basically that the polls were actually wrong the other way in 2022, which was a midterm election when the presidency wasn't up, but Democrats were responding to the Supreme Court rulings on abortion in particular and other things. And the polls vastly underestimated the Democratic strength in that election. So if it turns out that the polls are wrong in the way that they were wrong in 2022, Harris could win by a comfortable margin, and this will all be over on Tuesday. My guess is that it probably won't all be over on Tuesday, and we'll be wondering about this for days or weeks.
Well, speaking about it not being over on Tuesday, last time in 2020, Trump obviously called the election into question and disputed the results. If he loses this time, do you think we'll see a similar thing here?
That's 100% guaranteed. The real question in that sense is whether these challenges rise to the level that they did on January 6th in 2021, just before Biden was installed as president, or whether it'll be even worse. I did talk to one expert a few weeks back who said he's less concerned about the threats to U.S. democracy if Trump wins than if Trump loses, for precisely this reason.
Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens next Tuesday and also in the next 4 years. But for now, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Nick.
That was Nature's Jeff Tollefson. For more on that story and the rest of Nature's election coverage, check out the show notes for some links.
Finally on the show, it's time for the briefing chat, where we discuss a couple of articles that have been featured in the Nature briefing. Nick, what have you been reading this time?
Well, I've been reading an article in Nature about some preliminary results from a clinical trial showing that, poo milkshakes might be beneficial for babies born by C-section.
Okay, poo milkshakes. Go on, what is it?
I mean, it does sound rather strange when I just put it like that, but basically, to give you some context, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that babies born by C-section versus those born by vaginal delivery have more chance of getting certain conditions like asthma and various immune conditions. And so the reason that scientists believe that is because they're not exposed to the mother's microbes as they come out through the birth canal. So there have been various ways of trying to give them some of those microbes. So there have been swabs of the mother's vagina that's been then swabbed on the baby and that sort of thing. But those haven't always been that successful because it doesn't seem like those microbes can actually colonise the gut very well. So this is another way to try and do that by using a bit of the mother's poo in a little milkshake to try and get those microbes in there.
So they are literally taking, we'll say, the fecal matter from the mother and mixing it into a milkshake or into the mother's milk, or?
It's into milk. I would say it's only 3.5 milligrams as well. So it's a very, very tiny amount. And one really important thing to clarify here is this fecal matter, as you better put it, has actually been screened to make sure there's no pathogens or anything that could cause the baby any harm. So please, 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 anyone listening, do not try this at home. Experts were involved in doing this trial.
Okay, so how did they get on with this poo milkshake?
So they had 15 babies that had these poo milkshakes and 16 on a placebo. And they showed that the two groups had very similar microbial diversity at birth, but from the second day of their life, there was a marked difference between them, and that persisted until around 6 months of age when they started eating solid food. And this data aligns with what was seen with an earlier pilot study where researchers showed that 7 babies had microbiomes that were very similar to babies that had been delivered vaginally when they'd had this sort of fecal transplant.
So is this going to become commonplace for C-section births now?
Well, maybe, but I think there's a lot more work that still needs to be done. One of the key things will be to try and figure out what are the microbes that are colonizing there, because a better approach would probably be just to take those microbes rather than taking like a stool sample or something like that and mixing it into a little milkshake. So that would be one thing. And also, it's not clear like how much of a difference this will make. So statistically, in a large group, you can show that babies born vaginally have less incidence of asthma and things like that. But on an individual level, it may not make that much difference. So researchers want to try and understand who is most at risk and who may, benefit the most from something like this. So a lot more work to be done. And yeah, I think it'll be a while before we start to see this as a routine thing.
If they do roll it out, they might have to think of a better name than a poo milkshake, I think. But so let me talk about what I've been reading. So I've been reading an article in Nature that talks about a newly discovered species of tardigrade that has revealed the mechanism behind them surviving extreme radiation levels. So I love a tardigrade. I don't know about you, Nick, but I think they're one of my favourite organisms. You might know them as water bears, but you probably know that they can withstand some extreme conditions, extreme heat, extreme cold, and even withstanding radiation levels at nearly 1,000 times higher than the lethal dose for humans.
Yeah, no, they are extremely hardy. There have been experiments where they've thrown them into space and all sorts of things, and they seem to have, been able to manage with aplomb. So I'm curious what it is about this new species that enables them to figure out how it is they're so hardy.
So basically, around 6 years ago, scientists were in the mountains in China's Henan province, and they were collecting moss samples, and they took these moss samples back to the lab, and they looked at them under a microscope, and they found an undocumented species of tardigrade. And so they thought, okay, well, let's have a look at this tardigrade, see what's going on. And they sequenced the entire genome. So it revealed that it had 14,700 genes, and about 30% of those are unique to tardigrades. And they found thousands of these genes became more active when they were exposed to radiation. So they exposed these tardigrades to radiation doses of 200 and 2,000 grays. So that's far more than would be survivable for humans. And they found that nearly 3,000 genes involved in DNA repair, cell division, and immune responses became active. So there is this set of genes that are increasing their activity when they're exposed to radiation.
Wow, so they have like a specific set of genes that's just to try and withstand these crazy conditions. Why?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if they're specifically turning on only when exposed to radiation, but they're increasing their activity. So they're going into overdrive when they're exposed to radiation. Why is a really good question. I don't think we truly know. So one of the genes, called TRID1, it encodes a protein that helps to repair double-strand DNA breaks. So it recruits proteins to the site of damage. There's another gene called DODA1, which seems to have been acquired from bacteria through horizontal gene transfer, and that enables tardigrades to produce different antioxidant pigments called betalains. And these pigments can sort of absorb and mop up some of the reactive chemicals that radiation causes to form. And these chemicals are what sort of account for a lot of radiation's damaging effects. So if they can produce these pigments, then they can take away some of those effects.
That's super interesting. And I'm wondering as well, radiation is obviously not just bad for tardigrades, it's also bad for humans. Is there a way to take something from what we've learnt here to apply to humans in any way?
Well, the authors actually treated some human cells with these betalains from tardigrades, and they found that these cells were much better at surviving radiation than cells that weren't treated. So there is definitely something in these pigments. And, it sort of points to this defense system that protects DNA from damage that radiation causes and protects it from any breaks that do occur. So not only is it sort of shielding, it's also repairing damage. And I just think I mean, tardigrades are amazing. In the future, the authors hope that perhaps these proteins or these genes could be harnessed to help protect maybe astronauts from space radiation, clean up of nuclear pollution. And one that really sticks out is maybe improvement of cancer treatment. If you can target an area of radiation, but ensure that the cells that you don't want to be damaged stay healthy, that could be incredible.
Well, I'm looking forward to a future where we have tardigrade enhanced abilities to deal with radiation. Thanks, Emily. And listeners, for more on those stories and for where you can sign up to the Nature Briefing to get more like them straight to your inbox, check out the show notes for some links.
That's all for this week. As always, you can keep in touch with us on X. We're at Nature Podcast. Or you can send an email to podcast@nature.com. I'm Emily Bates.
And I'm Nick Petrichow. Thanks for listening.